You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, episode 581, Critical Care.
Welcome into another episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm John Champion. Each week on Mission Log, we carefully assess the situation and vow to do no harm as we examine an episode of Star Trek and pick it apart for the morals, meanings, and messages and see if the whole thing stands the test of time.
This week, Critical Care, the one where Voyager's doctor finds himself teaching a bunch of aliens about medical ethics, even if he has to hurt some of them in the process.
I'll be back with trivia in a moment, but first, Norman is going to tell all of you how to reach us.
You know we'd love to hear from you. Mission Log is a conversation about Star Trek. Find us on Facebook at Mission Log Pod and on Instagram and Threads at Roddenberry Podcasts. The conversation always continues in the Mission Log Discord with near-daily live events and 24/7 chat about the topics you love. Get your invitation to our private server by joining patreon.com/missionlog. While you're at it, one of the most important ways to help your favorite podcasts is to leave a 5-star rating and a review at Apple or your preferred podcast platform. And remember, your comments could be used on the show. And now here's John Champion with this week's diagnosis.
All right.
Trivia. This week's diagnosed trivia.
There we go. All right. So trivia for Critical Care. We have a story by Kenneth Biller and Robert Doherty. So we know both of these names pretty well by now. Robert was the young wunderkind, the youngest staff writer for Voyager when he started in 1997. The most recent of his teleplays we discussed was Imperfection, and Ken, by the 7th season, of course, was showrunner and executive producer. His most recent credited episode in order of our discussion was Repression, even though this episode was produced prior. The teleplay credit goes to James Caan. Now, to be clear, it's not actor James Caan, C-A-A-N, and it's not Khan, K-H-A-N, as in wrath of. No, with the H before the A. This is James Caan, K-A-H-N, who was a supervising producer in this final season of Voyager. But his Trek credits actually go back further. Think back to TNG's 5th season episode, The Masterpiece Society, which is based on a story that James pitched. We will see 3 more stories credited to James later this season. This was directed by Terry Wendell, and the last we discussed Terry's directorial work was with Lifeline, and we usually repeat here that Terry was a visual effects designer for years on some major projects before turning his attention to directing. His first with Trek was the Voyager episode Gravity, and we will see him a few more times before the end of the season. We have got a fair number of guest stars in all manner of alien species this week. The one who is the root of all the problems is Gar, played by John Cassier. Now, John has just a massive career, starting back with his early appearance on Star Search. Here's a little side bit of trivia for you. He beat both Sinbad and Rosie O'Donnell and won the stand-up comedy competition in Star Search. So that was back in the 80s. Also in the 80s, he started, what turned into him pushing nearly 300 credited roles in everything from TV to feature films to a huge slate of voice acting work. He played Shemp in the TV movie about the Three Stooges. His voice appears in cartoons and video games of all sorts, and he is even the voice of the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt. And here's another side note. He has also done a lot of live theater, and he co-starred off-Broadway in an underappreciated gem called Three Guys Naked from the Waist Down, alongside another familiar name, Scott Bakula. And by the way, I know what you all are thinking, and that show, Three Guys Naked from the Waist Down, it's a euphemism about doing stand-up comedy, how that leaves you fully exposed to the audience. Great show. I saw it back in the day. Great soundtrack. Check it out. Now, Voyager is on a bit of a wild goose chase for most of this episode, and among the aliens that they meet, there's a miner played by John Durbin, a returning actor who was in full reptile makeup in TNG's Lonely Among Us, and then as Cardassian Gul Lumek in Chain of Command, and he appeared again in DS9 in the episode A Simple Investigation. John Franklin plays the traitor Kip, and while this is John's only Trek appearance, he made some fun appearances elsewhere, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and even the movie Children of the Corn, and he even played Cousin It in the Addams Family movies. Also, with an appearance from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, frequent TV guest star Jim O'Hare plays a distraught husband, soon-to-be ex-husband here. Jim works constantly, racking up over 200 credits, going back to the early 90s with shows like Third Rock from the Sun and ER, all the way up to his most recent appearances on Dr. Odyssey. He may be most recognizable, though, as Jerry on Parks and Rec in over 120 episodes. His wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, is played by Debbie Monahan, who we mentioned for her brief appearance in the DS9 episode His Way. Most of Debbie's credits on screen occur in the 80s and 90s, going back to the big screen adaptation of A Chorus Line. In more recent years, Debbie has switched careers and become a fitness instructor. On Level Red, we get to know a patient and an aspiring doctor. The patient, Tebbis, is played by Dublin James Wahlberg, and he did most of his on-camera work from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. He made the rounds of TV guest roles, including Seinfeld and The Drew Carey Show, and also lent his voice to a number of video games and animated projects. The up-and-coming Dr. Voji is played by Paul Scherer. Earlier in his career, Paul was a regular on the short-lived Van Dyke Show in 1988, and then found himself as a series regular twice more on Free Spirit and Sons and Daughters. This episode of Voyager is near the end of Paul's on-screen credits, and later he retired from acting, moving back to his home in Indiana, where he owns a real estate business. Moving up to Level Blue, we meet a Dr. Dysek, played by Gregory Itzin, and his face should be familiar to a Star Trek audience. We first met him in the DS9 episode Dax, where he was Ilan Tandro, and he tried to kidnap Jadzia Dax. Then, not long after, we saw him as Hane in Who Mourns for Morn, and he was a criminal in that one too. And we're not done with Gregory yet. He will be back for 2 episodes of Enterprise in 2 different roles. Finally, Administrator Chelik is played by Larry Drake, and Larry's career spanned TV, film, and live theater going back to the early 70s. At the time of this episode of Voyager, he was probably most recognizable to TV audiences for his Emmy Award-winning role Benny on the long-running series L.A. Law. Genre audiences may have recognized him from Darkman or from Dr. Giggles. Larry appeared in over 80 roles in his on-screen career, and sadly, we lost him in 2016 at the age of 66.
Welcome to the Delta Quadrant. Please hold. The next allocator will be with you shortly.
Prologue. A small spacecraft flies over a huge alien city and approaches a giant hovering ship. Inside the massive hospital ship, a traitor of sorts named Gar approaches Chelik, a medical administrator, overwhelmed by the patients he is attending. But Gar demands his attention to show off his latest piece of acquired technology for sale. He produces the holo emitter and boots up Voyager's EMH, who is confused to find himself in an unfamiliar place. Act 1. Gar and Chelik negotiate while the doctor indignantly points out that he isn't for sale, he's been kidnapped. The two ignore him, and the argument is interrupted when a medical emergency presents itself as injured patients flood the ward. The doctor can't help but do what he was designed to do, treat the wounded, even if the tech here is decades behind what he's used to. Back on Voyager, Tom and Harry limp into sickbay after a bruising round of holo hockey, but the doctor is not quite right. He barely looks up, says his usual greeting, and tells him to take a pill. A closer look reveals this doctor is just a copy of an old training file. It's a fake! Someone swapped out the real doctor, and Janeway wants answers. She traces the swap to the moment Gar left Voyager as a guest, having spent the night in sickbay with what he claimed was food poisoning. Neelix says he may have been the unintentional accomplice. He spiced up Gar's dinner amid complaints that it was bland. He thought the illness was real. Janeway tells him not to blame himself. Men like Gar don't need help finding a scam. Meanwhile, the doctor is doing outstanding work on the hospital ship. He impresses one of the resident physicians, Voyager, and he offers to contact Voyager for supplies, but Voyager says that would require layers of red tape. It's all got to go through a governing administration computer known as the allocator. The doctor has to make do with what they've got. The doctor chats with Tebbis, a sharp mine worker with a knack for self-diagnosis. But Tebbis also shows signs of an untreated chronic illness. Why? He doesn't have enough treatment coefficient. The allocator system doesn't consider him worth the resources. Chelik returns and informs the doctor that his program has been purchased and reassigned to Level Blue, where presumably the patients in the most need are located. The doctor follows and finds that Level Blue is anything but critical care. It's quiet, calm, orderly, and fully staffed, a far cry from Level Red that they just left. Act 2. Time to learn about the Denali healthcare system. Treatment is dictated by a treatment coefficient, a calculation of one's societal value. High TC, great care. Low TC, good luck. The doctor challenges the morality of it all, but the chief physician, Disick, shrugs. It's just how their post-ecological collapse society survives. When the doctor asks about Level Red, he's ignored. Back on Voyager, they track a warp signature, also a fake, to a dead end. But Tuvok has an idea. Gar traded iridium ore, which has a short half-life. Harry narrows the search to a mining operation on a nearby asteroid, and it turns out the alien in charge was also swindled by Gar. He wants his ore back, and he gives Janeway a lead on a place called Velos, where Gar offloaded other stolen tech. Back in Level Blue, the doctor watches Disick at work and notes a high TC patient receiving cytoglobin as an arterial aging preventative, not urgent care for chromoviral infection. Tebbis is on Level Red, dying without the same drug. The doctor is outraged, but Disick insists it's efficient. If Tebbis's value goes up, so will his care. Returning to Level Red, the doctor and Voyager try to boost Tebbis's TC by faking credentials, but the computer says no. Tebbis, having reassigned himself to his fate, tells the doctor he could be spending time with other patients. But the doctor isn't done. Back on Level Blue, he acquires an extra dose of cytoglobin, claims it's for a patient there, then smuggles it back down to Level Red, where he administers it to Tebbis. Act 3. Voyager arrives at Velos. A merchant there explains Gar was working with a buyer who said he could be trusted. Cut to that buyer, and he is in a bad place, having lost his wife to Gar. Cut to the ex-wife, who's convinced Janeway is trying to steal Gar from her. To shut it down, Janeway lets her think Tuvok is her husband. Tuvok is not amused, but the ruse works, and she points them to Gar's next stop, a gambling tournament on Selleck 4. Back on the hospital ship, Tebbis is feeling better after the cytoglobin. He's suspicious, but buys the doctor's lie that Chelik had the allocator reevaluate his TC. Others on Level Red need help, though, as Tebbis points out, so the doctor brings more doses that he acquired and asks Voyager to help administer them. Voyager refuses, but Tebbis steps in. The doctor walks him through it while Voyager watches, then decides to join them. Later on Level Blue, Disick confronts the doctor about the sudden uptick in unnecessary treatments. The doctor spins it. The allocator cuts supplies if meds go unused, so technically he's helping. Disick raises an eyebrow, but plays along when Chelik checks in. Looks like the doctor is learning the system quite well. The patients on level red improve, and the doctor tells Voyager that even more cytoglobin will be on the way. Tebbis is much better now, but he asks to stay on level red so he can keep learning. The doctor says he doesn't plan to be around too long, and Tebbis suggests that he can learn from Voyager. Voyager finally catches up with Gar, activates a tractor beam, and beams him directly to the brig after he plays dumb and tries to shake free. Back on level red, the doctor searches for Tebbis, patient R12, but he can't find him. The allocator answers that patient R12 has been moved. Tebbis has been transferred to level white. Voyager clarifies, level white is the morgue. Act 4. The doctor confronts Chellick over Tebbis' death, an untreated secondary infection. Chellick knows that someone gave unauthorized cytoglobin injections and restricts the doctor to level blue, hardwired into the allocator for full surveillance and time management. Meanwhile, Gar isn't cooperating about the location of the EMH, even under Tuvok's threat of a mind meld. Neelix drops by with dinner, and Gar eagerly wolfs it down until Neelix mentions it contains Talaxian wormroot, which can cause, well, some really unpleasant gastrointestinal symptoms. Right on cue, Gar doubles over in pain. Neelix assures Tuvok the symptoms are harmless and reminds him only the doctor has the antidote. Suddenly, Gar is much more cooperative. On level red, Voyager is working on a patient when a nurse tells him that the patient is to be discharged. Voyager bristles, but the allocator pulls rank and sends him to assist Dysek. Only, surprise, the doctor summoned him up to level blue. He needs Voyager to smuggle out his mobile emitter down to level red to help those in need. Voyager helps, and the plan works, just seconds before the allocator shuts the doctor down. Now back on level red, the doctor turns the tables on Chellick. He injects him with Tebbis' blood sample and the chromovirus, and now Chellick finds himself the newest patient on level red. Act 5. The allocator scans Chellick but sees Tebbis, a low TC patient, so it promptly denies him care. The doctor demands that the cytoglobin stockpile being used for preventative care on level blue be redirected to actually treat patients on level red. Voyager tracks down the hospital ship, but B'Elanna can't isolate the doctor's signal. He's been fully integrated into the ship's computer. When they hail the vessel, the allocator responds in its bureaucratic tone. Chellick is unavailable, and only he is cleared to speak with aliens. Back in the ward, Dysek finds Chellick under the doctor's care. When Chellick orders cytoglobin, Dysek refuses. It's not approved for patients on this level. However, Dysek is intrigued by the doctor's observations about system inefficiencies. The doctor suggests a workaround. Just reclassify a few patients, including Chellick, as level blue. Suddenly, everyone's eligible for better care. Back against the wall, Chellick agrees. That's when Chakotay and B'Elanna beam in to bring the doctor home. Later on Voyager, the doctor gives Seven a checkup, but he actually needs her help. He wants her to examine his own EMH program, specifically his ethical subroutines. He confesses that he poisoned Chellick to make a point and save lives. Seven coolly likens it to the Borg's logic, sacrificing one for the many. The doctor isn't thrilled by the comparison. After a thorough scan, Seven has to admit, ethically speaking, he checks out just fine. The end.
Fantastic job on the recap, John. And I'm wondering how much critical care it took for you to be able to condense all of that, because it's a pretty plot-heavy episode.
It's plot-heavy, but I was telling you offline, the important thing is to get through those plot points and let's save the analysis, let's save the motivation for later, which is where we are now. But I can't help but start out with a technical note, because the teaser segment here is really tight, and I really like this alienscape. I think it was Voyager flexing its CG muscles a bit as we go headstrong into season 7. There's just a lot there. The city itself, the ship flying by, and then this hospital ship. Very impressive piece.
I mean, it really does set the tone for where we're at. And speaking of setting the tone, when you bring in a Larry Drake as a guest star, you kind of know where that character is going when it comes to just basically it's kind of like the essence of his character, which is really, really great. And something that I know that this isn't this kind of story in a way, but at the beginning, when I saw Gar open up the box and show Chelik his holo projector, I'm like, is this going to be another Hijack the Doctor episode?
Yeah. Fortunately, it goes a different way. It's not all about the jailbreak,
Right.
Really like Gar. I don't love the makeup, I gotta say. It's a little weird, but I really like Gar, and I kept thinking he's got kind of a Jeffrey Combs character vibe. Like if we hadn't used Jeffrey Combs in Sunkatse, I could see him playing this role. I like the Doctor commenting on the tech in this hospital ship because it's kind of like McCoy deriding the primitive tech that he would come across every now and then, especially like in Star Trek 4 or other places, just can't be bothered with it.
Well, I mean, City on the Edge of Forever, cutting and sewing up people like garments. The doctor says, this patient needs 20 milligrams anesthetine. Give me a hypo spray. Mm-hmm. So the doctor just gets turned on. He's on an alien world. He doesn't know the physiology or the actual species of any of these aliens. So how do you administer the right medication based on what he just learned?
That's making a big assumption and definitely a possibility of malpractice.
I have a point, actually a very specific point about this later.
Okay.
It made me go,
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. All right, we'll come back to it. What we won't come back to is space hockey.
Oh, God. You mean hockey in space?
Yeah, space hockey. Hockey in space. Yeah.
Hollow hockey, I think you said in your recap.
I did.
Not horse hockey,
no.
Which was a little bit more apropos. Those uniforms were just bad.
Oh, no. Yeah.
They were terrible.
Yeah.
They were just bad. I'm sorry.
They were,
They're just not good.
Also not good is the duplicated doctor program. Now here's what's weird. Wouldn't a replicated fake just be a copy? I mean, it is a funny pretense that the doctor could be replaced with a lesser than copy, but a copy is a copy. There's only, those ones and zeros can only go so many places. So I guess Gar was in a hurry. Like, I'm just going to make a little one. All he knows how to do is come on and say, please state the nature of your medical emergency. That's it. So,
by the way, you're summoning Vreenak twice in your recap.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Chef's kiss.
Thank you.
Everyone out there, applause. Really, you should.
Thank you. Vreenak will never die in my heart. I mentioned it at the top, but we get different angles of the hospital ship, and I thought it looked even better from these other angles because it kind of has a retro sci-fi design with that like stacked bridge and just kind of the bare metal. I thought it was really cool, and wow, Level Blue looking great. We could just hang out there for a while. They got everything. It's like, a lobby of a Hilton. I mean, good job.
I thought it was really smart, for the production designers to segregate like these different sections, and it made it really easy for like the audience, we as the audience, to identify, okay, this is kind of like the emergency room, critical care, but also where everyone that doesn't have quote unquote insurance is going to stay. And then all of a sudden you have this Hilton-esque, fresh, flowerly decorated, neutral and calming tone, blue sector being the one where, the elite are being taken care of.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so smart.
Production design is great, and especially for a series where we know overall they'll kind of cut corners. Like, well, okay, if we have too much in the way of guest stars and new sets, we have to immediately pivot to a bottle episode so we don't completely blow the budget. I think every dollar is on screen here. It's really nicely done. Love this line. Chelik says the doctor, an agricultural engineer is obviously more important than a waste processor. And, the doctor has his appropriate response, and my response is not when the waste is backing up, dude. That's, right. We very quickly learn who's important.
I know, everyone complains about something until you need the something that you're complaining about fixed.
Yep.
At timestamp 11 minutes, 22 seconds, when Chelik says to the doctor that a patient's TC and explains what the TC is, his value or his or her value based on what they provide society.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Robert Picardo just responds to that with his eyes is so good, because I felt that exact same response in my bones when that guy said that about the TC. I was like, come on.
For real. For
right?
real. Yep.
Speaking of Gregory Itzin, there's always kind of like been this really interesting quality about, as a particular actor, what he brings without even saying a word, right? And then he's a great actor, but like Larry Drake, you gotta get what you get out of a Gregory Itzin when you cast somebody like him.
Yeah.
What I think is great also is that there is kind of a twist and a turn in his character that we'll talk about later that I thought was really good.
Good.
So I'm glad that he was cast in this role.
I really liked the idea behind the cytoglobin, that it could treat this viral infection, but it also is preventative. And I thought it was just a good choice, preventative against arterial aging. That's something that is very relatable. And wouldn't we want exactly that thing? That would be a high commodity item if it existed.
Pretty interesting, like in terms of a post-scarcity economical dynamic, which doesn't exist, obviously, in this section of the Delta Quadrant. If you don't have a replicator, then what?
Yeah.
Right?
By the way, that's jumping way ahead, but, Voyager should not give them replicator technology, even though they are post-warp. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe the Doctor can make a case for it.
By the way,
in part 2.
Even in the future, nurses still get bossed around horribly by doctors.
Yeah.
Even if the Doctor was like Disick did that, but even if the Doctor was like just kind of faking it, he was still bossing around the nurse.
Yeah. Now, in an episode with a lot of very heavy moments, I thought they balanced that out nicely with a bit of earned comedy. And the whole round robin of the people that Voyager has to find and all these people who got duped by Gar, I thought the pacing of that, the editing of that, the reveals were terrific. And I love the bit of Janeway having a man just casually reaches her hand back to Tuvok, and the look on his face, gold.
It was gold. I mean, I did a spit take on that, and I also would have liked to have seen Chakotay's reaction if she did that to Chakotay. Just for the JCers out there.
Too much.
That's too much. Yeah, it would have actually ruined like Tuvok's moment, but still, I think it would have been really funny.
Now, I know that this is important to understanding the character journey for the Doctor here, but I mean, the Doctor just straight up lies multiple times, and that is, of course, important and interesting for this episode, but may have ramifications later on. If you know that, okay, this machine that treats me, even if we afford it a personality, even if we afford it rights, he can also lie. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward in our Voyager recaps and rewatch. Very interesting conundrum. I love how Tebbis is the one who clues in the Doctor, because he's so innocent, he's so optimistic. Yeah, now there's other people here who need to get treated. Oh, and if that isn't just a weight, thrown right on the Doctor. By the way,
it's like having your own John Carter, like Dr. John Carter, for Noah Wiley's character.
Right?
That's kind of him, right?
Yeah, for real. Speaking of weights, the Doctor has a very big box to carry around all those little hypos.
Can you imagine? Like, so here's your hypo, and here's a pad that explains to you how to use the hypo.
And they're all going to be in a huge box. Right. And, each one carefully padded,
No wonder they can't afford resources.
Now, I love this bit with the Doctor getting his lesson and explaining a lesson in economics to Disick. And I know that you have your own take on this, but I had watched a video explaining the Soviet economic system and its many downfalls. But this struck a nerve with me because in that documentary that I was watching, they were talking about how, you wanted to perform just below the level of expectation. Because if you fell too far down, well, okay, that's the problem. Then we're going to get a visit by the people we don't want to visit from. But if you exceed, oh, no. That's when they figure, well, you're doing so well. that we can take away the resources you have. We can take away manpower that you have.
It's planned obsolescence.
It is.
Right?
It is. And that, oh man, it just hit me right on the head. Like, yep, that's it. That's how it works. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, again, so I mentioned kind of like, my appreciation for Gregory Itzin for, being cast as Dysek. And now you know why. Because in this scene, you get to see a character that you think is smarmy and elitist and kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
But he's not.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because the system put him in Blue Sector where he got comfortable with where he was, but maybe he is that kind of doctor. Like, you know what? I really need to treat patients. That's my job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I like being in an air-conditioned, flower-scented ward.
Right.
But I still want to do my job.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
The doctor has a great line, that feeling you get from healing someone, infectious, isn't it?
That was awesome.
Very clever.
At timestamp 29 minutes, 43 seconds.
Yep.
I'm going to get to this way, way, way later. But I have to say, it's probably one of the most well-written Gene Roddenberry-esque scenes I have ever seen in all of Star Trek. And it was basically when Chelik was trying to tell the doctor the algorithmic system of prioritizing patient care, that in and of itself, we could probably spend 3, 4, 5 episodes just talking about that on.
The shades of A Taste of Armageddon.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I kind of enjoy the idea of the allocator, for all of its problems, also being a terrible kind of micromanager. This whole pretense, like, you have 1 minute to treat this page. You have 6 minutes to treat this page. Just always there, like, I can turn you on, I can turn you off. That's what he does.
Yeah, I mean, the doctor gets turned into another resource.
Yeah.
Which was, par for the course for this episode.
Yeah. Cut back to the brig. What is Gar eating? Because the Talaxium wormroot, I have to point out food. It's what I do. It sort of looked like little sticks covered in powdered sugar. Like there was this kind of nest thing underneath, and then all these weird, just little, these like sticks covered in powdered sugar.
Maybe it's funnel cake.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Then I want it. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind getting sick off some funnel cake.
Sure, that's fine by me.
As we've all done before.
Yeah.
I do like the ethical approach to, well, quote unquote, ethical approach to coercing Gar, because he had Tuvok threatening him with a mind meld.
Yeah.
And then Neelix actually poisoning him in a way.
Straight up doing it. Yeah.
And saying, by the way, if you want, your Tums, give up, the location of where the doctor is. I thought that was interesting.
And nice parallel to what's going on back in Level Red, because the doctor pulls a Neelix by forcing illness upon Chelik. A bit more dramatic, a bit more serious, but similar situation happening over there. Then I said to myself, you know what? It's kind of an episode of Undercover Boss. that Chelik has to go through now what he has forced his employees and the people he's charged with to go through. And you know what? This is a bigger point, but there are so many big points to make in this episode. And I've said it on the show before that we shouldn't need to force someone to feel empathy. That should be the starting point for all things. But I will save my breath for right now, because we'll get more into it.
Yeah, I mean, seeing these kind of violent reactions, we see this in a lot of storytelling. And it is a reflection of certain things that happen with this kind of scenario today. So, again, we will talk more about this later.
Yep. Couldn't help but smile with Janeway being trapped in a customer service phone tree. That just,
good way to describe it.
Yeah, that just speaks to truth right there.
When Voyager says, you said it yourself, doctors heal, we don't make patients sick. The doctor says, I don't know any other way to help these people. I like the conundrum that he's in, and I think that this is the way that they should have treated Bashir a little bit more in Deep Space Nine.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Also point you to a great bit of dialogue between Chelik and Dysek. Chelik laying there immobilized on that stretcher, going through this terrible thing. I made the rules. And then Dysek just saying, then you should be pleased that I hold them in such high regard. Oops. Sorry. Your rules just came back to bite you in the butt. It was a little weird. I felt like I wanted more there because it was a little incongruous. We cut back to Voyager and suddenly we're in sickbay, and now it is some, greatly elapsed time later. And then it's the contractual obligation scene for 7 of 9,
Yeah.
It is weird. I honestly forgot about her in this episode. Now, don't get me wrong. It is a very good scene. I wish we had more on Hospital Ship 42. I think there is more to explore there. But here's 7. Good scene. And she says, I'll quote her directly here, "You were prepared to sacrifice an individual to benefit a collective." And the doctor bristles at that. But I thought, hey, did she just stumble upon some Vulcan philosophy and twist that over to Borg speak?
Yeah, I'm wondering if this was her own way of saying, that, yes, you are growing a conscience, Doctor, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. And this also goes, it's a really good point that you bring about not seeing 7 this entire episode until the end, because it just proves to you that if written right and if stocked with the right actors and the right guest stars, you can create a very good show without Jerry anchoring the show.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Now, of course, we have a big problem going forward. Does this mean that the Doctor is damaged in some way and can't be trusted if he doesn't trust himself? Or has his programming realized that the moral principle at stake is of the highest value? And by the way, is this how we finally get self-driving cars? We'll get right back to Critical Care right after this.
Before we jump back into the show, we want to give a huge thank you to everyone who entered our Borg Queen Skull giveaway with Factory Entertainment.
Now, seriously, your enthusiasm was incredible. It was one of our biggest giveaways yet, and if you were one of the lucky winners, congratulations. If not, don't worry, there's still something in it for you.
Right now, you can get 10% off your first order at factoryent.com when you use the promo code MissionLog at checkout.
Now, whether you're eyeing that prop replica that you missed out on, or you're looking to upgrade your shelf with some Federation flair, or you just want to browse some truly cool collectibles from across the geek galaxy, Factory Entertainment has got you covered.
And if you're heading to San Diego Comic-Con or Star Trek Las Vegas, make sure to swing by the Factory Entertainment booth. Check out their latest merch in person, and don't forget to tell them we sent you.
That's 10% off with the code MissionLog at factoryent.com. And if you're at either of those conventions, go say hi to the team. They're as passionate about fandom as you are.
And trust us, if they've got new Trek gear at the booth, you'll want to be first in line.
Your subspace transmission is very important to us. Please continue to hold for the next available allocator.
Well, I'm glad that we've, come back finally to episodes that are just sort of light entertainment.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Just like, another fun day and 1920 Chicago, running around, just doing it. Nope. That's not what this episode is.
It's not family fun,
No, it's not the family
movie
fun
for the summer
episode. Yeah. No. Yeah. Heavy dramatic stuff with a lot of important and interesting, relevant topics to cover. And what's interesting is that we have a lot of different alien species, all with different roles to play here. And it's interesting. I was trying to understand if Chelix people, I had to look this up, they're the Jai, Jye, as opposed to the Denali, who are the ones who are there as patients on the hospital ship. But are Chelix people entirely known for being administrators? Is that like a skill and they just go into other places and do this? They get hired as consultants. For this purpose, I'm just going to get right to it. They are the insurance companies. That's their role here. And they also have this other sort of weird role in relationship to at least Dysek's journey here. They sort of allow the doctors to keep this plausible distance from the hard decision-making about who lives and who dies. Like, no, you just keep doing your job. Don't worry too much about what else is going on here. We'll tell you what you should be concerned about and where you should focus your efforts. And if something goes wrong elsewhere, that's not really your fault. That's what we take on because we're hired to do it. And they have built themselves into this just huge bureaucratic nightmare, which I think we can all understand. But I think even more what we can understand now, covering this episode in 2025 compared to when it came out 25 years ago. This is what happens when we let algorithms rule our decision making. The allocator is AI, and the AI is just using math. It's just using the black and white values of math to figure out, well, if we tip over to 51% here instead of 49% over here, this one stands a better chance and this one should live. And by the way, we're really getting into Logan's Run territory here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where we just decide, it's not about the people. It's about the success of the society that they're in.
The Hunger Games as well.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. I think all of our discussion in this episode is really going to lead us to our final comments, our final morals, meanings, messages, statements, because they can't help but be intertwined in that way. But, the thing ultimately that's missing here is a conscientious and conscious, but a conscientious guide to help determine how are we making these decisions. The computer, the allocator, might be a tool that can offer information, but it can't actually be a decision maker. Mm-hmm. I refer you to a favorite show of ours where very often in Main Mission on Space 1999, the computer would say, human decision required. I think that's a good model for a computer.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier a taste of Armageddon, because going all the way back to the original series, there's something that's very similar that's taking place. So on the two worlds, Eminar and Vendikar, you had basically kind of like these war games computers, very much like the Whopper, in the movie War Games, back in the 80s with Matthew Broderick.
Yeah.
So you had these computers run simulations, and then based on those simulations, you had these areas that were basically saturated by bombs that were never fired, but these people had to report to disintegration chambers because they represented the statistics of deaths, in that war. So what they essentially did, and what they're doing here on this facility, with these different levels of TC and the analysis by the algorithm and by the allocator, allocator?
The allocator, yeah.
What they're doing is that the doctors, in a way, and I'm not putting it all on the doctors, but those who were there to treat patients have abdicated their responsibility emotionally to those patients in order for them to be able to continue on their work, because there were so many patients they had to treat.
Yeah.
When you remove yourself from the horrors of the decision-making processes, triaging patients, who survives and who doesn't, then you also remove the connectivity of your own morality and empathy.
Yeah.
In storytelling, when I used to study comic books and comic book storytelling, the further away that you create your scene, your establishing shot, the further away from the emotion that you don't see, the less empathetic you are to that character or to that emotion. So as doctors or as administrators pull away from being able to actually be on the ground level with those patients, hold those patients' hands, look into their eyes, they have no idea what those patients are going through. And very much, in certain examples, don't care.
Yeah.
Because they are conditioned not to anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a very cautionary tale here, and a very cautionary tale, obviously, today. Because when you let a computer run the numbers and crunch the algorithm, all you're doing is getting numbers and algorithm in return.
Yeah. All it can provide is information. All it can provide is data. It can't put any sort of value on that data. That's for us to do. And it's interesting that you're talking about this process because, let's go the other direction for a moment here. People who are medical professionals, in whatever context, they make incredibly difficult decisions all the time, and they face very difficult situations all the time where the decisions may seem cold or unfeeling. I mentioned it a long time ago on Mission Log, a book called The Psychopath Test by John Ronson. And as Ronson looked into what is the making of a psychopath, he realized that some of those personality traits actually loan themselves to people who excelled in certain professions. And very often that was in medicine. Mm-hmm. People who were very high-performing doctors, because they had the ability when they needed to be a bit detached in decision-making. But it didn't mean that they completely cut themselves off from the weight of their decision-making. It just means that when the time comes, they could do that better than maybe some of us who aren't trained in that role.
Right.
So there is that element there. But obviously, when you just completely give up and you just say, no, the machine knows better than I do, and I have to do what the machine says, that's when that person's humanity is completely gone. By the way, I refer us back to this this conversation that Chellick has about who is less important or less vital, pointing out poor Tebbis versus the agricultural engineer,
Mm-hmm.
And I love that the doctor asks, but less vital to whom? Which is that we have this really easy time having tunnel vision about who's important to us right now and not realizing how interconnected we all are and all of our roles are, which I think plays out very nicely when Chellick gets this blunt personal experience at the end, which is, oh, no, now I actually have to see things through somebody else's eyes. What if I am not considered to be as vital or as important? Well, no, guess what? You actually are dispensable too, mm-hmm. because what you do is this interface between us and a computer.
The thing is that we already seeing Tebbis being turned into a doctor in the episode.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the doctor took Tebbis under his wing. Once he was able to cure his disease at that time, then he was able to put Tebbis to work as a doctor's aide, as a nurse, essentially, helping people actually improve their quality of life in this completely overwhelmed red sector. Right? So that's the thing. Chellick's TC analysis on Tebbis saying, well, he doesn't have the high enough clearance to get further medication because you, doctor, have allocated all of his injections for what the TC designates. But if the doctor said, but look, he's actually helping me. He actually has worth. It should increase his TC because he's actually helping patients. But the allocator says that's not how this works, right? Yeah. He can't improve his station or his TC or his coefficient just because he has an uptick in his ability to provide a service, to all of these other patients. So it's just one of those, well, yeah, you're talking about this one particular person who's just a patient, but has the ability to become further than what he is or his lot in life, versus somebody who maybe just be this person, they just have this lot in life. They were just born with a silver spoon, one more silver spoon more than Tebbis did. Or Tebbis had. So that's the thing. Like when the doctor just looks down, it's like, you got to be kidding me. You're saying that you get to choose, or your formula gets to choose who actually gets care and who doesn't, because of what they say in that the particular algorithm says about, yes, they have just the better opportunity for that care to provide them as a valuable member of society for the rest of their lives.
Well, I'm going to make the big bad historical example here, and let's talk about Chellick in that context, in that regard that you just described. He embodies what Hannah Arendt described as the banality of evil. Think about that scene where Chellick says about Tebbis, if the boy had been fit, he would have survived. And I love the doctor's line in response to that. Why don't you just put a phaser to their heads? Because ultimately that is the goal. And, what you're talking about here is this decision-making of who lives, who dies, who is worthy, who's not. And it's easy in this respect, through the metaphor of science fiction, to look at them as the TCs, medically more valuable or not. We have a pretty easy time as human beings doing that when it comes to races, when it comes to sexes and sexual orientation, when it comes to religious or political beliefs. We do that too. And I only need to point you to the early mid-century in Europe. You can draw those connections.
So othering, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So remember, he is just an administrator. He didn't create the system. He didn't create the allocator. He is just an administrator. And he is just the guy doing his job like Adolf Eichmann.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it was. And it's so easy to do when you can point to somebody else and say, well, why did they do this to themselves? One might say, if only they had been stronger, if only they had been smarter, if only he had gone to the right school, if only he had picked the right career path instead of doing whatever it was that he was doing. Well, then he would have earned the Cytoglobin.
It's like if Nietzsche himself created this algorithm.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if you were strong enough to survive, then, by default, then you would be able to increase your level of your coefficients so that you can become a more productive member of society. You just have to prove that just in terms of the genetic superiority that you have versus why you're actually there to be treated to begin with. It's staggering when you really think about it. And it's kind of like... it's its own version of the trolley problem when you really think about it. And,
Sure.
It's the abdication of, well, it's not really the abdication of, you have to make a choice. But in this case, you can abdicate the responsibility of that choice because there's something that is a little bit more nebulous when it comes to the morality, right? It's a program, just like M&R and Vendicars. It's the computer that's deciding who's dying, not me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
the bad guy here. No,
you have to wash your hands of it.
Right?
Yeah.
You're the bad guy because you haven't for 500 years. You haven't solved the problem.
Yeah.
And you've been doing so for 500 years.
Well, and look, you and I have been, both of our fathers were doctors, and we've been around doctors and the medical profession. And if anybody is sort of misunderstanding what we're saying here, triage is a thing, and making decisions, allocating resources. Yes, that is a thing, not to the horrific extent that we see here, which is really based on a kind of prejudice.
Uh-huh.
That is partly what drives the story. I want to switch gears ever so slightly here because I want to, I went from a historical connection. I want to go to a historical fiction connection. And yes, I'm going to bring up a couple of our favorite characters. Okay, go with me. The doctor is Jean Valjean, and Chelik is Javert.
Okay.
So when we try to live by standards of moral certainty, where all infractions are equal, then there is no moral principle anymore at all. Okay, laws are guidelines, and they're a part of the social contract, but those laws also have to give way to moral imperative. All right, Valjean needed to steal that bread, just like the doctor needed to treat those patients. They are living up to the higher moral ideal. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Good. That I rest my case.
No, I mean it's an interesting premise that you have here, because the way that I don't really have an issue with the premise itself, but they also have to ask the question: is there a medical prime directive?
Okay. Ooh, all right.
Okay, because,
go with me here. Going all the way back to say like McCoy giving a woman a pill that grew her a new kidney.
Yeah, I mean, we can add that to the equation, but this is before when I said, why would the doctor immediately treat a patient for a species he doesn't know or for the reason why that patient is there to begin with? He saw obviously kind of like the external injury and says that this patient needs this because he's bleeding out. How do you know your anticoagulant is going to work? How do you know that, that your treatment is going to provide the relief that you think it's going to provide? So at the beginning of this episode, right around that scene, the doctor says, Fortunately for these patients, I am programmed with the Hippocratic Oath. It requires me to treat anyone who's ill. Now, I don't have any issue with that. That's the truth. And just to clarify, unless I'm mistaken, and maybe, I don't know, Memory Alpha can probably shed some light on this, the Starfleet Medical Hippocratic Oath is a representation of the traditional oath, which at its core principles is the tenet of do no harm.
Right.
But what if you, as a physician, actually do harm in the act of trying to preserve life or administer aid? Right? That's where I'm just kind of like, I'm not saying that this is what the doctor did. I'm saying that the possibility exists. Did the doctor...
He runs a very high risk of doing that because he's showing up in a place where he knows nothing about this species.
Exactly. So did the doctor, because he didn't have the full scope of what was happening to the population inside this facility, did he put more patients at risk because of the Hippocratic Oath? Does his oath, like you're saying, because he does have the moral imperative, as Valjean did, to save his sister by feeding her that stolen loaf of bread, right?
Yep.
And Javert says, the law is the law, you cannot break it, period.
Yeah.
Did he have the moral imperative, and does that circumvent the violation of a medical prime directive that prevents other patients from suffering as a result of his action? Because he's saving one life.
Yeah.
But what happens to the resources for the other patients whose lives also have to be saved? Because now he's not just entering kind of like this unknown issue with all of these different patients, but he's also entering a political structure for healthcare that he has absolutely zero control over, and basically has to force his position in a way that completely discounts his oath of doing no harm when he does what he does to Chelik. So again, it's like doing no harm by an action is violating the oath. Harming by violation of action, because you have the moral imperative, also violates the oath. So where are you in the right or the wrong when it comes to saying, I'm in the moral right for doing this? And I'm just wondering, for the listeners out there, for you and for the listeners out there, apply this to our past doctors, right? This is a really fun exercise. So Bones, like you said, giving the dialysis patient, that old elderly lady in Star Trek IV, just she gave her a lollipop or something like that, or like a mint, and said, hey, or Crusher or Pulaski or Bashir, maybe even Phlox, or maybe any of the doctors in the Kurtzman era, like, what would they do? Right? Because are you willing to say, I'm right to save one life, and I'm also right putting the other lives in jeopardy because that one life to me has to be saved?
All of our allocators are busy computing other patients' treatment coefficients. Please stay on the line.
We've assessed the patient. And the patient, in this case, is our episode. And the episode, in this case, is Critical Care. It's season 7 of Voyager. And at the end of our deliberations and our discussion, in our fine analysis of the entire episode itself, we have arrived at what we do on every mission log episode. We take a look at what we've discussed and see if this episode holds up. Does it withstand the test of time? And then we see if we were able to mine any morals, meanings, or messages. So this is our emergency room. The patient's on the table. And now Dr. Champion, Dr. Lau. It's funny because those are our dad's names.
Those are our dads,
How are we with the patient at the end of Critical Care?
This patient, under the right care and attention and compassion, survives and thrives. I feel like we are right back at classic TOS, TNG style storytelling with this one. The stakes are entirely relatable and relevant. The setting and the premise is high concept. It is high concept sci-fi like it should be. And the whole thing plays out with strong actors and compelling roles. And it just sort of, it fires on all cylinders. You know, you have the eye candy of this sci-fi setting. Like I said, I think it looks great. I think they spent the budget wisely in bringing in the actors that they did and really fleshed out this little corner of the galaxy here. But at its heart, we got to tell a relevant story. Now, look, you can find places to nitpick. Go ahead. That's fine. This is an ambitious episode. You have a lot of sets, a lot of characters. Not everything's going to be perfect. That's okay. Got to trim the budget where you can. But I don't think they really did that here. I don't feel like they cut corners in a way that deeply impacted the show.
Not like the allocator did.
Not like they, no. At the end of the day, this is Star Trek doing the Star Trek thing, which is you take an idea about morality, in this case about medical ethics, about othering, about what we're about to get into in our final summation here, and then you create an engaging drama around that that makes you think. And this is one of those that I think I could have watched 20 years ago or now and think, wow, okay, as a piece of drama, it works. As a piece of relevant social commentary, my God, does it work, and probably work stronger than it did back then. And we'll get into that. But yeah, this is fantastic. This is Star Trek doing Star Trek in such a strong way. It holds up. Norman, if you say no, I'm walking out the door.
You know,
that's not true. I love it when we disagree, but
you know that's not going to happen with this episode.
I know.
A variety of different reasons, many of which you've already so eloquently described. I mean, for me, this holds up absolutely and in every way, yes, because I have been, and I very well may be critical of Voyager episodes, especially of Voyager episodes that we've seen and we've discussed, and I'm on record for saying some of the things that I've particularly disliked, in the past, and maybe sometimes it'll happen in the future. But today, in this episode, when Voyager hits, it hits big time.
Yeah.
Right? Critical care is a bullseye for me. Just like Imperfection was, and that was sandwiched, like this episode and that episode, in between are sandwiched a couple of very problematic episodes.
Yeah. Drive.
That, in and of itself, right? When you get back to the Star Trek formula of the Roddenberry-esque vision of being able to take a modern issue for any generation and bring it and see it through the lens of the science fiction narrative, that is very impactful for me, why I watch Star Trek. Critical Care is a near perfect example of answering our mission statement questions for the show. Does this episode hold up? And does it stand the test of time? And why we do this kind of analysis for ourselves and for the audience. As of right now, the issue that is represented in this episode, it's the privatization of healthcare. And it's perhaps at its peak of being the greatest single existential threat to humanity at large. Now, we saw what happened with the Doctor and Chelik in this episode. The Doctor essentially torturing Chelik in order for him to relent as the allocator and to provide medication for the patients.
Yeah.
Luigi Mangione is perhaps the most current example of that in our society of violently pushing back because he and many others refuse to watch themselves and their loved ones be codified and reduced to a simple algorithmic variable. John, you and I have said before in many other episodes that not every, even if they work, not every episode needs to be a bonk bonk on the head kind of story, But in this case, at the heart of the core of this episode's story, this healthcare issue literally affects the entirety of humanity. It affected the entirety of all of the civilizations, in that medical facility, and that's kind of like what we're seeing through the lens of the science fiction interpretation. We've shown how deeper the policies lean into privatization then, in that fiction, but in our reality too, right? Yeah. The more we divide ourselves, the way that they did that in the episode, in the TC levels of those who can afford to live and those who are quietly and coldly told you can't, that's not science fiction anymore. Now, that's reality.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that people can still see this episode today based on our recommendations, and I hope they do. Give this a second shot, watch it, and say, tell me that this episode isn't directly reflecting our times.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's what brings us to our morals, meanings, messages. And I immediately feel like this segment, by design, it's going to be a bit inadequate to cover the multitude of topics that are in this episode. And even just the sheer size of medical care and medical affordability and access, particularly that we face in the United States. Now, I know that we have listeners all over the world, but the majority are here in the U.S., and this is very much front and center with larger political discussions, political and societal. It doesn't just come down to parties clashing over this. There are giant issues and giant issues of cost at stake here as well. And I told you even before we started recording today, so those who listen to the preamble in our VAM, it angers me on a level that we even have to relate to an episode that is an indictment of the lack of accessibility of medical care. You know, I realize that different countries have different systems. Some places are better, some places are worse, but we have a very specific kind of struggle in the U.S. where it comes down to cost, and it comes down to, as you just mentioned a moment ago, large companies that rely on numbers to decide who gets care and who doesn't. Or even if they do get care, what happens to their lives after the fact? Do they go into bankruptcy? Can they ever afford to pay off what they had? I mean, it's an absolute mess. And so that's just the preface to the specifics I wanted to get into here. But I will say that I cannot wait for the rest of our audience to comment on this and share what you all found in watching this too, because this is multifaceted, this is deep, and we're just the two of us. We're only going to be able to share what we get out of it in this moment. There's a lot more to dig into here. I looked at this and, I start taking my first round of notes immediately, and then I have to go back and kind of hone that a bit. And I thought, well, okay, we could do a whole riff here about AI. And we could do a whole riff here about allowing computer programs to make really tough calls without some sort of human checks and balances. And we tell each other that all the time, that AI is flawed and makes mistakes and needs its work to be checked. But we are also forging right ahead in a kind of AI arms race across governments and corporations. So I guess we just see how that turns out. I mean, the allocator is just a purpose-built AI, and that was 25 years ago, described in this little light piece of science fiction. As we were getting ready to record today, I saw a piece pop up in my news notifications about Amazon basically saying, yeah, we're going to cut a whole lot of jobs because they're better replaced by AI. And I don't know how many jobs that means. I don't know how many people then just suddenly find themselves with nothing to do, and then how much that is a ripple effect across other countries for other people or companies rather, for other people who need to work. So when I first started watching the episode, I had a lot of these immediate reactions about technology, class, our medical system, at least in the United States, which again has some advantages over other systems, but it has a lot of shortcomings in comparison too. And that gap between the haves and the have-nots has always been there, and it just feels like it always will be. And that's part of the depressing part of that story. So we need stories like this to remind us that our worst impulses need to be kept in check, no matter how, quote-unquote, advanced we may become. I also started thinking about Hippocratic Oath. I'm glad that we got to talk about that today, and how easy it may be for someone to act against their own stated principles because either they were pushed by circumstance or by a system that was unbending, or maybe purely out of convenience. I was reminded that there are a lot of really good doctors in the world who do what is right every day based on their experience and based on the tools that they have. And as bad as our system may be here, I have never once met an ER doc who said that they would turn away somebody who needed help but didn't have the right kind of insurance. And by the way, that's the indictment right there of our own for-profit insurance industry. The fact that even has to be a question. Then, as I was putting my notes together for this very show yesterday, I got another news alert from The Guardian UK. And the headline was, I quote exactly, "Extremely disturbing and unethical new rules allow VA," that's Veterans Administration for anybody who doesn't know, allow VA doctors to refuse to treat Democrats, unmarried veterans. There are others that you can follow in that story. But that was the headline. And now before anybody indicts my source or waves their hands and say, oh, but wait, no, not really that. Nobody's actually forcing anyone to do that yet. Nobody's forcing anybody to forego treatment. It's not a rule. It's a guideline. Let me assure you of one thing, which is that I have checked this out with medical professionals, and that is the direction. And let me also assure you of this, that the very fact that there would even need to be such a headline, the fact that there is a change in rules which could even be interpreted in a way which denies care to somebody who needs it, means that we have lost the plot. We have lost the moral authority on this topic. If we can't start from a place that recognizes the inherent dignity and humanity of all people who rely on our own sense of compassion and empathy to treat them, then we have lost this particular battle. We're sitting here today talking about a sci-fi show written 25 years ago, taking place 300 years from now, and the message in that story is so very clear, that technology can rob you of your humanity when you see people as numbers, when you see them as others. But it didn't stick then, and I'm not convinced that it has stuck now. We've gotten so far away from having learned anything that we are right back to where the Jai, represented here by Chelik, started this administrative nightmare. I have bad news for you folks. We're not Starfleet. That's not us. Not here, not now anyway. And we will not be until we decide that we can treat all people as equals. Norman, I've got this damn box over here, and I need to slide it over to you because I need to take a moment.
John, that was very powerful what you said, and it echoes a lot of my own thoughts. And I just want to start off with my final analysis here by stating that, kind of as a disclaimer, these are my own thoughts. These are not the thoughts of John's, who shared his as eloquently as John always does. These are not the thoughts of the Roddenberry podcasts or anyone associated. These are my thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And I need to express them in a certain way because this subject is very personal to me. And I want what we've talked about on this episode today to shed more discussion on this topic with our general audience at large. Because the only way that we're going to educate ourselves about this topic is to continue the conversation and not polarize the discussion between one party or another, one morality versus another. As the human race, we cannot afford to do what Chelik and the allocators did to their healthcare system. If we continue down this road where healthcare is commodified, where life and death are auctioned off to the highest bidder through deductibles and premium plans, where a child's survival depends more on their zip code than their biology, then we are not a society. We are a market. And in that market, profits are high and compassion is bankrupt. If you truly believe in the vision of Star Trek, not just as a sci-fi fantasy, but as a moral compass, the North Star guiding where we should be going as a species, then you must believe this. Universal healthcare is not a luxury. It is not a perk. It is a right. It's a basic right, as basic as clean water, as basic as clean air. Now, John, we said this in the show. You and I grew up as the son of doctors. And maybe doctors of a certain generation, when we saw the ideals behind their white coats, their lab coats.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
My dad told me you treat the patient no matter what. But what happens when the business model no longer allows that? What happens when the algorithm, not the oath, decides who is worth saving? When I was going through my nearly 9 months of cancer treatment in the hospital, I heard the conversations. The fear in the voices of patients wondering if they'll just survive a terminal illness, period. Not because of the biological component, but because their insurance won't cover the treatment. I've heard nurses talk about staff shortages, overworked shifts, how they triage care based on what the insurance allows, not what medicine demands. Now, we've watched as other industries are privatized: mail, education, transportation, and with each demographic shift, access for the poor becomes a privilege for the rich. So why do we think healthcare is going to be any different? How many brilliant minds will never invent the cure for cancer because they didn't have access to the healthcare that could have saved them from cancer? How many future authors, filmmakers, musicians, leaders, how many future somebodies will be buried in anonymity simply because their parents had to choose between groceries and a doctor's visit? And looming ahead, it's the cold future, one where there is a very strong possibility that an insurance AI algorithm will calculate your value to the system, your worthiness of treatment, based on your health score, your job, and your income. Imagine being told that your life or the life of someone you love doesn't qualify, not because the help doesn't exist, but because you can't afford to be helped. That's not progress. That is not civilization. That is not the Star Trek future we deserve. If we don't fight now for universal health care, for fair access to education, for systems that lift up the many instead of just indulging the few, then we lose something greater than comfort or convenience. We lose our humanity. So again, I'll say it again. If you truly believe in Star Trek, if you believe in that better future, then you must believe this. Healthcare is not something that's for sale. It is for everyone.
Mission Log is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you'd like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com, and for more Star Trek news and discussion, visit trekmovie.com.
On the next Mission Log, Inside Man.
Some of the music for Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com. Special thanks to consulting producers, Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Chris Garris, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Shabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi. We are experiencing an unusually high volume of communications traffic, though the fact that we have a recording saying that would seem to indicate otherwise. We hope that neither your patients nor yourself have expired. End transmission.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.